You know how Fox has a weird way of counting Simpsons episodes? They refuse to count a couple of them, making the amount of episodes inconsistent. The reason for this is a lost episode from season 1. Finding details about the missing episode is difficult. No one who was working on the show at the time likes to talk about it. From what has been pieced together, the lost episode was written entirely by Matt Groening. During production of the first season, Matt started to act strangely. He was very quiet and seemed nervous and morbid. Mentioning this to anyone who was present resulted in them getting very angry and forbidding you to ever mention it to Matt. I first heard of it in an event where David Silverman was speaking. Someone in the crowd asked about the episode, and Silverman simply left the stage, ending the presentation hours early. The episode's production number was 7G06. The title was Dead Bart. The episode labeled 7G06, Moaning Lisa, was made later and given Dead Bart's production code to hide the latter's existence. In addition to getting angry, asking anyone who was on the show about this will cause them to do anything they can to stop you from directly communicating with Matt Groening. At a fan event, I managed to follow him after he spoke to the crowd, and eventually had a chance to talk to him alone as he was leaving the building. He didn't seem upset that I followed him. Probably expected a typical encounter with an obsessive fan. When I mentioned the lost episode, though, all color drained from his face, and he started trembling. When I asked him if he could give me any detail, he sounded like he was on the verge of tears. He grabbed a piece of paper, wrote something on it, and handed it to me. He begged me never to mention the episode again. The piece of paper had a website address on it. I would rather not say what it is, for reasons you'll see in a second. I entered the address into my browser, and I came to a site that was completely black, except for a line of yellow text. A download link. I clicked on it and a file started downloading. Once the file was downloaded, my computer went crazy. It was the worst virus I had ever seen. System restore didn't work. The entire computer had to be rebooted. Before doing this, though, I copied the file onto a CD. I tried to open it on my now empty computer, and as I suspected, there was an episode of The Simpsons on it. The episode started off like any other episode, but had very poor quality animation. If you've seen the original animation for Some Enchanted Evening, it was similar but less stable. The first act was fairly normal, but the way the characters acted was a little off. Homer seemed angrier, Marge seemed depressed, Lisa seemed anxious. Bart seemed to have genuine anger and hatred for his parents. The episode was about the Simpsons going on a plane trip. Near the end of the first act, the plane was taking off. Bart was fooling around as you expect. However, as the plane was about 50 feet off the ground, Bart broke a window on the plane and was sucked out. At the beginning of the series, Matt had an idea that the animated style of the Simpsons world represented life, and death turned things more realistic. This was used in this episode. The picture of Bart's corpse was barely recognizable. They took full advantage of it not having to move and made an almost photorealistic drawing of his dead body. Act 1 ended with a shot of Bart's corpse. When Act 2 started, Homer, Marge, and Lisa were sitting at their table crying. The crying went on and on. It got more pained and sounded more realistic. Better acting than you would think possible. The animation started to decay even more as they cried, and you could hear murmuring in the background. The characters could barely be made out. They were stretching and blurring. They looked like deformed shadows with random bright colors thrown on them. There were faces looking in the window, flashing in and out, so you were never sure what they looked like. The crying went on for all of Act 2. Act 3 opened with a title card saying 1 year had passed. Homer, Marge, and Lisa were skeletally thin and sitting at the table. There was no sign of Maggie or the pets. They decided to visit Bart's grave. Springfield was completely deserted, and as they walked to the cemetery, the houses became more and more decrepit. They all looked abandoned. When they got to the grave, Bart's body was just lying in front of his tombstone, looking just like it did at the end of Act 1. The family started crying again. Eventually they stopped and just stared at Bart's body. The camera zoomed in on Homer's face. According to summaries, Homer tells a joke at this part, but it isn't audible in the version I saw. You can't tell what Homer is saying. The view zoomed out as the episode came to a close. The tombstones in the background had the names of every Simpsons guest star on them. Some that no one had heard of in 1989. Some that haven't been on the show yet. All of them had death dates on them. For guests who died since, like Michael Jackson and George Harrison, the dates were when they would die. The credits were completely silent and seemed handwritten. The final image was the Simpsons family on their couch, like in the intros, but drawn realistic, sort of like the lifeless style of Bart's corpse. A thought occurred to me after seeing the episode for the first time. You could try to use the tombstones to predict the death of living Simpsons guest stars, but there's something odd about most of the ones who haven't died yet. All of their deaths are listed as the same date. Everyone remembers the show Doug, one of the original Nicktoons. It seemed like a pretty normal show about the challenges a young boy faced in his daily life, but I always got a weird kind of feeling from it. Compared to other kids' shows, Doug seemed more negative and anxiety-centered. Doug was always worried about something, and in most episodes he would have fantasies of everyone he knew cruelly laughing at him due to whatever problem he was facing that week. Doug always came through in the end, though, and every episode ended with him writing in his journal about how he had overcome his blown-out-of-proportion problem. In 2005, I began to have dreams about the show for no apparent reason. I can't remember the details, but they made me want to see the show again. The show had not even been seen in reruns for years at that point, so I couldn't think of any way to see it again. To my surprise, however, it came back for 1 week in fall 2005, airing at 6 a.m. on weekdays. I watched it for all 5 days. The first 4 episodes I remembered, but they didn't sync up with my memories perfectly. It'd been a while, so I just chalked it to the flaws in my memory. The Friday episode, though, was something I was positive I had never seen before. It started with a normal intro, with the line drawings, but the characters never appeared. The lines continued as normal, reacting as if the normal characters were there. Once the intro ended, it switched to show Doug in a dark room, writing in his journal. He wasn't narrating his writing like he usually did. He just silently wrote for about a minute. The screen faded out, and the usual episode title screen appeared. Yet, there was no skit this time. There were just giant letters forming the title. Doug's Real Life. The episode opened with Doug eating breakfast. He was giving a voiceover about how there was a big test and he neglected studying for it. As his family was having a normal conversation, the screen started flashing. The flashes seemed to be showing something, but they didn't last long enough for me to figure out what they were revealing. Doug left his house and began walking to school. During his stroll, he had one of his fantasies about his life being ruined. Mrs. Wingo announced that Doug had flunked the test, and the entire class started laughing at him with their heads swirling around him. This went on for longer than most fantasies, and the laughter sounded crueler than usual. When Doug got to school, the screen flashed again. This time, it stayed on the new image, or rather the new animation style. The colors were darker, and many objects had changed color. It resembled a negative film. Doug was walking through the school hallway, which was full of kids who had never been seen on the show before. No one paid any attention to him. After Doug got to his desk, the animation switched back to normal. Suddenly, for no reason, the scene changed to after school had ended. Doug was walking home, worrying to himself about the test. Upon reaching his house, his dog Pork Chop greeted him. Doug began talking to him until the screen flashed. Pork Chop turned into a hunk of rotting meat, and Doug's house became decrepit. Doug went into his house and acted as if he was talking to someone, though it was completely deserted. After interacting with invisible people for a while, he sat down at an empty table. The screen flashed again, and Doug's family was there with him, eating dinner. The phone rang, and Doug's mom answered it. He instantly thought that it was his teacher telling her about him flunking the test. Doug had a fantasy about his parents yelling at him for failing. In it, they grew to be gigantic, and their faces became twisted and dark red. The screen flashed back to the empty house. Doug was crying and apologizing, but there was no one else in the room. He went back up to his bedroom, which was completely empty except for a book and a pencil. Doug picked up the book and started writing. He narrated this time. I can't tell which one is real. I just want to start off by saying, if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't, but it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view episodes days before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity. so it took them longer to start up the season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and 2 other interns were in the editing room, along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty, and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't even final yet, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles, such as How Sex Doesn't Work When SpongeBob and Patrick Adopt a Sea Scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card, Squidward Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it. The happy-go-lucky music played as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing the clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down. He has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The Bubbles splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, sound is synced up with animation, so yeah, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that's common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward's in full frame and looks visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd with SpongeBob in center frame, and he too is booing, very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing, though. What is odd is everyone had realistic eyes, very detailed. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red. Some of them looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children yet. The shot goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window is of a night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part is that at this point there is no sound. Literally, no sound. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking in the silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob softly. He put his tentacles over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. All the while, a sound in the background very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly begins to zoom onto his face. By slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at the shot 10 seconds apart side by side. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it twists on itself for a split second, then back to normal. The wind through the tree sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is the sound and Squidward's sobbing sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes the sound was coming through from the other side. As good a sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good and produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. His face was mangled and bloodied. One eye dangling over his upturned face popped. He was naked down to his underwear, and his stomach was crudely cut open, his entrails lying beside him. He was lying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were, of course, mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, and half body in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was done in a realistic style, looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it were that of a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing, a deep baritone, lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew he had to. This time the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was lying on her stomach, her berets in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye, too, was popped out. Naked, except for underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her, above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in size and shape to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done, just the same as the others in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all of his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep-voiced laughing. This time, the still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and backed up. This time, the photo was of a boy. about the same age, but this time the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out of a stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different. We couldn't tell what. He went on to the next same thing. He went back to the first and played them quicker. And I lost it. I vomited on the floor, the animating and sound editors gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creator to see this, who arrived within about 15 minutes. He was confused as to why we called him down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer, full frame of the face, for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and the deep voice said, "Do it." And we see a shotgun in Squidward's hands. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter spattered on the wall behind him and his bed. He flies back with force. The last 5 seconds of this episode show his body on the bed, on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg is obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what the heck was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind and caused me horrible nightmares. I'm sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp on it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was ever identified, and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in inexplicable phenomenon before, but now that I have had something happen and can't prove anything about it beyond its anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things.